right, 26 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I want to tell you a quick little story. A long time ago, I worked at a little radio station that was floundering. Mm-hmm. And pretty much the only income they made was Sunday mornings. And so I was always working Sunday mornings. And Sunday mornings made money for the station because the station would sell time to local churches, as we do here too, by the way, if you're interested. And we had every slot filled from probably 7 o'clock until noon. And so that was my job on Sunday mornings. I would come in and make sure all those programs played. And then one of the churches dropped off and decided not to do it anymore. And that left a half hour. And pretty much the boss said, well, do whatever you want, because he didn't care anymore. He was ready to get rid of that station. Okay. For those local people, that was WTMC, which no longer exists. Mm-hmm. But that's what it was. Anyway, so this was Sunday morning, and there was a Bible at the radio station that was called the New Living Bible, I think it was, the New Living Bible. And I decided to read the New Testament during that half hour. In other words, a little bit, like a half hour worth each week. And I read the entire New Testament over the course of however many weeks it was. And do you know that somebody bought the station and things went pretty well for a little while after that?
Yeah.
It was pretty, I don't know if I always put two and two together and say that's probably why. But anyway, I'm not a biblical scholar in any way, and I would always say to the listeners, the same thing you hear us say now during News Bites, we don't offer any opinions during them. Well, when I would read the New Testament during that period of time, it probably was close to a year. I don't know how long it took me. But I would never say anything other than what was written. I would identify the passage, et cetera, et cetera. The experience for me was a little bit of better understanding of the New Testament because I had never read it in kind of my language. I always, in church and stuff, I'm not a Bible scholar, so I really didn't understand everything. And not that I do now. So there's another one. There's another translation I want to tell you about. And in fact, I'm not going to tell you about it. I'm going to let the translator tell you. He's on the phone. David Bentley Hart is an Eastern Orthodox scholar of religion, a philosopher, a writer, a cultural commentator, a fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. And he has translated the New Testament. And I have the cover of it on the podcast if you're watching the streaming thing right now. Let's say good morning, David Bentley Hart. Good morning, sir. Nice to have you on the show.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks.
Where are you?
How are you?
I'm okay.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm in South Bend, Indiana, so I'm not all that okay. But
why? Is there snow?
No, but it's bitterly cold. I mean, it seems this year that spring is a distant rumor that travelers from far lands, it's like Shangri-La. It's a fabulous country that
so
I just hope will one day.
First of all, my first comment is you have a really clear phone signal. I'm so glad. Sometimes phone signals are this is you got a good phone.
Well, God bless the University of Notre Dame.
All right. So, what did you translate the New Testament from? That was my first question.
Greek. I mean, in the original Greek text, specifically what's known as the critical edition, the one that scholars think closest to the earliest Greek texts.
Is there anything in the new translation that is more accurate than other translations you've seen?
I like to think there's quite a lot that is. Part of the accuracy that I claim for it is the result of a willingness not to smooth out the difficulties of the original Greek. The original texts were written by men of varying degrees of education, and so some of the texts read quite well, like Luke and Acts and Hebrews. Some read rather badly, like Mark and especially Paul's epistles, and just undertook to preserve the differences in the voices, and then not to allow later translation conventions that are the result of theological traditions of later centuries to dictate how I translated the Greek. I tried to go directly from, as near as I could, directly from the 1st century to the 21st.
Does the fact that some of the writers were not that skilled at writing, does that kind of give us an understanding that they felt a need to write it, even though this wasn't one of their talents?
Yeah, no, I would say precisely that. Yeah, what came through to me in translating and in trying to capture the voices, especially trying not to make terse formulations elaborate or anything else. What came through to me was a sense that I was reading men who, some of them from very common walks of life, who felt an urgent need to communicate something that had gripped them, and it struck me actually more forcibly than it ever had before. And I've been reading the Greek for more or less all my life. I had the good luck of a classical education early in life, but not until I had to sit down verse by verse was I struck by just how urgent the tone often is.
And there was no answer this question. A lot of times you'll hear people who want to discount the Bible. They will say this wasn't written until 100 years later. I've heard 60 years later. I've heard. What is the truth as to when these were originally written?
It depends. The earliest texts we have in the New Testament are the authentic letters of Paul. Not every letter in the New Testament that bears his name was directly his composition. Some came in the ancient world. If something came from someone's school, from his disciples, or from redacted materials, it could be attributed to him. And then, so some of the things attributed to Paul were not written by him, but those that were are fairly close to the events of the immediate period after the ministry of Christ. But the Gospels come from a few decades later. They are based on earlier materials. We know that at least the sayings of Jesus had obviously been collected in what we call logia texts, and these were available to the authors of the Gospels. But none of the authors of the Gospels was a direct witness to the events. Mark's is the earliest, we think, of the Gospels, and it was part of the material used by both Matthew and Luke to give us a structured narrative of the ministry of Christ. So, right, if we want direct eyewitnesses, the closest we have is Paul, who claimed to be a direct eyewitness to the risen Christ, although he had never known Jesus of Nazareth in his earthly ministry.
Is that right? Wow. So how does this change, or does it change anything?
Well, I don't know how much that changes. I mean, that's been known for many. That goes back to the early days of the church. It was well known that these texts weren't immediate eyewitness accounts by the best scholars of the early centuries. For some people, I mean, there are those who I know, American fundamentalists who like to imagine that, say, the Gospel of John is the direct account given by the disciple John of Jesus, but and for them it might pose certain difficulties. But I think for most of the mainstream traditions, that's not a great revelation. But what one does have to know is that one's not dealing with documentary history in the way a journalist would write it today. That's not the issue.
I like to point that God is the foundation of our being, and that even atheists would be able to read this to kind of understand what it is that, like you said in your quote, what it is that they don't believe.
Well, that's a different book. We seem to be. That's one of my
right.
Other
but
books,
I mean, this
yeah.
but this book is really, sort of the foundation, the cementing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but I would want it. I'm hoping that the translation will actually not only give a clearer picture of the early church to believers and unbelievers alike, but that it will communicate, if nothing else, that the urgency in the voices of the authors is one of complete earnestness, that there was a real experience that was not just a fantasy or something. Today, a Christian who writes about his or her faith, as a rule, is writing about a tradition that he or she has received and to which he or she is committed. These texts are nearer to the event itself, and so it's like getting closer to the Big Bang. You know, you can't get to the very moment itself, but the nearer you get, the more the phenomenon comes into clear focus. And what one, I think, discovers in these texts is a real sense of persons who felt they'd been gripped by this experience of the risen Christ or the immediate presence of God in history.
Some of the comments that I've read online about your book are pointing to simple things like instead of the Holy Spirit. And that to me is a huge difference, because would mean there's more than one. The means there's one, right?
It's sometimes, yeah, and sometimes not. You see, that's one of the things that's unclear in the original. In Greek, of course, the article is used slightly differently than in English, but when it's omitted, it usually means that there's not a definite designation there. So when it's missing sometimes from, well, in Greek, aion pneuma, Holy Spirit, it could be read as a Holy Spirit or just Holy Spirit, as though that were an almost impersonal principle. At other times, though, it is there. And so one of the tricks of reading the Greek is recognizing that the word spirit is not used in the same way by each author. And in some authors, like Paul, it's used in so many different ways that in the original Greek, you can't tell at times whether he's talking about the God spirit, the human spirit, both at once. So there are all sorts of unclarities. Certain authors seem to speak of the Holy Spirit quite clearly as one, but others it's not so clear. And I don't think there was any unanimity of opinion until later doctrinal developments.
I don't know if this is. I hope this isn't too dumb of a question. I was a religious scholar. I'm almost reluctant not to ask this, but let me ask it anyway. Do the women in the Bible ever write? I mean, did Mary or Mary Magdalene or any of the other women in the Bible ever write any of the texts that were found?
Not that we know of. No. It would be if they did. The texts haven't been preserved. At least as far as we know, all the authors of the New Testament were males. But even that's a supposition, because many of the texts are really pseudonymous or anonymous. For instance, we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, so, yeah, you can take a guess.
Okay.
In the eastern part, let me just make one quick point on that, though. In the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Greek, the Hellenistic part of the Roman Empire, educated women scholars were more common than in the western part, the Latin-speaking. So there is always a chance that an anonymous text in Greek from that period could have had a female author.
And the gentlemen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they would write about similar events, but at different times.
Well, yeah, I mean, they all come from decades after the event. Luke's is probably the last of the Gospels that was written, though it might be John's. And Luke is drawing, though, on ancient materials. So I should point out, or materials of many at his time that go back to a time very near to the time of Christ's ministry. But though they're writing at different times, I should point out that with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a common fund of materials. That is, Mark's gospel is the narrative structure that both Matthew and Luke borrowed, but then all of them draw on collections of sayings of Christ that had been preserved at that time, but most of which we've now lost, except as they've been passed on in the canonical Gospels.
The books after the four gospel books, where Jesus appears later on, can you talk about those? Do they change at all with the new translation?
Well, in what sense? I mean,
in any sense. I mean, because throughout, I've always been. Again, I'm just you're talking to a kindergartner when it comes to your subject. So forgive me.
Okay, all right.
Okay, but I've always.
Well,
I just want to say this. When I was a kid, I had the red letter thing, and the red letters were throughout the whole New Testament. They didn't just exist in the four books of the gospel. That's probably why I'm asking.
Right. In the later books, Christ is quoted, or in some cases, as in the book of Revelation, an apocalyptic picture of Christ appears, who also speaks. So, yeah. I'll say this. In my translation, in general, a lot of the theological language that people would be accustomed to isn't there, and other terms are in their place, and that is both. That's true of the words of Christ, both in the Gospels and after. I can't say in a general sense how it changes. I just think that throughout, anyone who is familiar with the more conventional translations will recognize the quite significant differences. And all I can say is that my aim was to say not what I thought the Greek meant, but simply to repeat what I thought the Greek said.
Which I feel like is greatly appreciated. I really do. I feel like I've often wondered if, when King James ordered the Bible to be translated, if there may not have been an agenda. And I believe in God and everything. I'm just saying, you never know, especially when a king orders something, right?
Right, and and of course there were agendas, the theological agendas. Remember, the whole project of translating the Bible into common tongues only begins in the 16th century, they come out of traditions that are theologically determined not only by the past centuries but by the disputes of the time. That's the period of the Reformation, the breaking up of Western Christendom, and so the translations reflect the theological dispositions of the translators, and I do think, yes, they do greatly distort the Greek. Actually, the King James holds up better than a lot of modern translations in that regard.
Oh, is that right?
But even that,
I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, there are modern translations that are just so fanciful, whether they're like committee translations like the New International Version or individual translations like N.T. Wright's, that simply basically force theological formulations on the text, even though they're not there in the Greek. The King James the translators of the King James tried to be as faithful to the Greek as they could, but they were writing out of a very fixed, developed theological tradition that had very specific expectations of the text, and it does, alas, distort the text in its movement from Greek to English.
Mr. Hart, I was wondering if I could tap into your expertise and go to the Old Testament just for a moment. I've since you are on the phone, and I've never been able to ask this of anybody, I've often wondered if the Jewish Torah is identical to like the King James version of those same five books in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. Are they identical, or does the Torah differ from what we know as the first five books of the Old Testament? I think it's five.
No, it doesn't differ in the translation like the King James, because the King James actually was made from the Masoretic Hebrew text. So, and that's the one used by Rabbinical Judaism to this day, although that's a critical text that was put together in the 9th century AD or CE. So what Christians used to read was the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, which is the one that, for instance, Paul quotes. So there would be differences before the modern period, not great differences, but differences between the Greek version of the Torah that most Christians knew and the Jewish Torah in Hebrew. But no, the translations that are generally available in English today were made from the Hebrew text as agreed upon by later rabbinic tradition. So more or less the same.
How about keywords like the word blessed? There was a paper written about your translation that said that you would substitute the word blissful, or did I misunderstand?
Yes, no, that's right. Yeah, and of course, I'm utterly unrepentant about that decision. That's a simple one, but the word makarios is translated often as blessed, and so in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, for instance, poor in spirit. But in a sense, the way we use blessed doesn't capture the strange force of the word in Greek. Makarios was originally a word that meant a kind of ecstatic transport, or a kind of joy like the joy of the gods or of the divine, and it's blissful. So I translated it as blissful rather than blessed. And I had one New Testament scholar say, well, that just makes me think of stoners and gurus, and I thought, yes, it does, and in a sense, that's the point, because the early Christian movement was not a socially respectable group, and they were seeking a kind of spiritual transport or bliss rather than mere comfortable blessedness. So
your book is doing pretty well on Amazon. It's number 3 right now in the Bible Contemporary English category, so that's rather impressive. When did the book come out?
I believe it was November. I'm very bad at remembering things like that. It was in the fall, and so it was number 1 at that time. So I've been happy with the response for the most part. The most boring responses, of course, have come from New Testament scholars who just want to argue about how they would have translated specific words.
Oh, really?
I've much more enjoyed the reviews written by literary persons or by people who, by people who are just curious about the Greek. They're not really interested in arguing over a single word here or there.
With that said, let me say this: that I think the average person who is a Christian wants to know if the translation holds up to their beliefs. Does the resurrection still come across as a real event, for example?
Yeah, well, I think that's true, and I think it does. I mean, as I say, what struck me forcibly, as it had never done before in making the translation, was that I was not reading people who had only a vague conviction or were just committed to this story because that was their community, but who really felt they'd experienced, many of them, Paul especially, felt he had had a real immediate encounter with the risen Christ. And there's no way, after translating it, I can't for a moment doubt the absolute conviction with which he reports that.
You have to wonder. I mean, we don't know. I guess we don't know. But we appreciate people like you who've dedicated their lives to understanding this book that really is the foundation of the lives we're trying to live, regardless of your religion. If there's a religious text, whether you're Muslim or not, your book is the foundation of your existence, right? I would think.
Exactly.
So I did find it on Amazon. Do you have a website you want to direct us to?
Well, just the Yale University Press website, I guess. I don't have one of my own.
Okay.
I'm a pre-cyber culture sort of guy.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, enjoy Southern Indiana. South Bend. South Bend, Indiana.
South Bend. It's not Southern.
Sorry.
Would that it were, yeah.
Sorry.
Southern Indiana is like Kentucky. It's actually quite lovely, but South Bend is something else.
I enjoyed this more than I can express. Thank you for doing this and for being on our show. I can't wait to read the book myself.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's got an interesting title, The New Testament. It's a new translation by David Bentley Hart. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll be right back.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident. For Monday, some sun, then turning cloudy and breezy for the afternoon. A couple of showers arriving in the afternoon inland, high 74 to 80. Then Monday night, looking mostly cloudy, a shower near the coast, low 60 to 68. On Tuesday, nice with episodes of sunshine, high 73 to 78. And Wednesday, mostly sunny and pleasant for the middle of the week with a high of 76 to 82. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Evan Duffy.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. President Trump is kicking 60